often what happens is we feel guilty and we may even berate ourselves, criticize ourselves. Oh, why can't you get out of this? Why can't you stop doing this? Like that. So I want us to, if we have some addictions, I want us to develop more compassion for ourselves. And that starts with understanding. So a warm welcome to everybody. Today we are discussing breaking the cycle of addictions. And our mission today, should you choose to accept it, is to look at what is an addiction, what are addictions, how are addictions related to trauma. So I'm going to be specifically looking at that aspect. And then how do we break the cycle? And I always say break it at the root, and that way you can break it permanently. So let's look at what is addiction. It's a compulsive engagement in rewarding stimuli despite harmful consequences. So in other words, we do things that give us dopamine, give us some kind of pleasure, even if there are harmful consequences. And often why we call it an addiction, if I'm going to be honest, there's loads of things that may give us a dopamine hit, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's an addiction. What actually makes it like fully into an addiction is where we lose control of the behavior, or the, shall we say, the attachment to that thing. We have no control of it. It's like it has a control over us. So this is a quote from Anne Clendening. She says, addiction is a pathological relationship in which you're like a hostage who has developed an irrational affection for your captor. So I really like that quote because it very much captures the mood of somebody who's addicted. It's almost like we know it's bad for us, but we can't help it. And what are different types of addictions? So let's have a look. So drug or substance abuse, that's quite an obvious one, but there are others. So alcohol. So you can read this one on the screen. Shopping, social media / internet use, gambling, and we have comfort food or comfort eating. We have sleeping. Yeah, sleeping can be an addiction. Gaming, and then watching movies or TV. And then finally, daydreaming, fantasizing. There are probably others. Maybe you might be aware of some other addiction that you might have. These are just as many as I could think of. So let's take, for example, shopping. That by itself is not a harmful thing. So what is it that makes it an addiction is when it becomes compulsive. So that basically means we lose control of ourselves. Like, let's say, we've got a deadline at work, and then we have this compulsive need to go on Amazon and buy something right now, when actually the urgent thing is we need to finish this project or finish this task that we're doing at work. So it's an addiction because it's now controlling us. And often it's irrational. So, for example, if somebody has an addiction, a shopping addiction, they often buy things that they don't even need. They already have um, one or two of those things, but they'll go out to the shop and buy another one just in case. So it's like it's an addiction. It's irrational. Um, and then there are often negative consequences. So if somebody, for example, has a shopping addiction, then they may spend on their credit card and rack up their credit card bill and not being able to pay it, and then being in debt and being in debt and being in debt like that. And they can't help it. They can't actually get a handle or control of themselves. So the activity itself might not be bad, but it becomes an addiction when it begins to control us. So if you look at these types of addictions, are there any of these that you go through? Are there any of these that control you? Something to think about. And even if there's something that may not be here, have a think. Is there something that you kind of obsess about that controls you? For some people, it might even be something as one sense as simple as I don't know, texting addiction. Like they're just constantly on WhatsApp, or they're constantly, the phone notification will go off, and it's like I have to look at my phone. And then, well, it might be an addiction to hearing from your partner. Now let's explore, why do we get addicted in the first place? And one of the reasons why I'm kind of exploring this is because I want us to have an understanding so that we can develop more compassion for ourselves. Just because we do that activity, and often what happens is we feel guilty, and we may even berate ourselves, criticize ourselves. Oh, why can't you get out of this? Why can't you stop doing this? Like that. So I want us to, if we have some addictions, I want us to develop more compassion for ourselves. And that starts with understanding. So why do we get addicted? So one of the reasons is to numb our emotional pain. So when there is some intense emotional pain there, whether it's anxiety or even if it's coming from a flashback from an associated trauma, some memory is there and there's some really painful emotion associated with that trauma, then we want to numb that pain. So therefore we turn to whatever that addiction is, because it helps us numb that emotional pain. Another reason could be because we already are going through a lot of emotional upheaval. It's called emotional dysregulation. Our emotions are all over the place. So then, and one of the reasons why is because trauma, especially in our childhood, can impair the brain's ability to regulate the emotions. Especially if you're in a very hostile environment in your childhood, your emotions were all over the place, your nervous system is on constant high alert. You can't regulate your emotions when your nervous system is on constant high alert. So because we have so much dysregulation with our emotions, now when there's increased stress from the daily pressures, whether it's at work, whether it's at home, whether it's an argument with a loved one, then that takes us into overwhelm. And so to free ourselves, or to take away the feeling of overwhelm, then we go into this addictive behavior. And temporarily, it does provide relief from that feeling. And then another reason why we could get addicted is to develop this false sense of control. At least it's like, at least have that sense, that feeling as if you're in control. Because one of the common traumatic experiences that people often go through is this feeling of powerlessness. So whether it's parents arguing, whether it's some situation that you just don't have control of, and it brings up that feeling of powerlessness, then addiction can help, at least for a little while, can help bring back that feeling of being in control. Unfortunately, alcohol is one way that often men use to bring back that feeling of being powerful. And then sometimes they misuse that so-called power in their relationships with their wife or whoever it is. Like that, it's very unfortunate. I've had to deal with some clients where their fathers were alcoholics, and whenever they would come home drunk, because probably in their childhood they were beaten up, they had difficulties with their parents. Now as an adult, now they're the ones in control, now they're the ones in the power, and they just abuse that power. It's very unfortunate. But just to understand that sometimes we develop an addiction so that we can bring back that feeling of power. Drug abusers often take drugs for that feeling again, to feel powerful again, at least feeling control of their own minds again. So hopefully going through this helps to start to understand why do we do that in the first place, and to bring some compassion. And I'll say this as well, not just to bring compassion to ourselves if we ourselves go through addiction. It also helps to bring compassion when you see others who are addicted. Just because somebody's a drug abuser, sometimes if you're walking going to town, for example, you might see a homeless person on the street, and often they're drugged up. Often we can tell that they're drug abusers. And sometimes negative thoughts might come up, like, oh, they're such losers, or there's such a drain on society, or some other criticism like that. But actually, when we start to understand the deeper reason why, that it's most likely they're not choosing to be in that situation, especially not when it's so cold in wintertime. I'm sure they're not choosing to be in that situation. So therefore, What is the underlying reason? And often it is something to do with some trauma, they're just trying to numb their pain, and therefore they're drugging themselves up. And of course, that leads to so many things, which ends up being that they end up homeless like that. So just bringing that, by bringing understanding, we can bring more compassion. So what happens is when there is a traumatic event, it often creates an emotional wound. Now, that emotional wound is the source, shall we say, of the pain, of that, the emotional pain that we experience. Now, because it's buried at the subconscious, especially from our past, then sometimes what happens is there is a trigger. So we don't necessarily feel it all the time, but then there'll be some kind of trigger, and bang, the pain from that emotional wound will all of a sudden come up to the surface. And we're just like, I don't know how to deal with this pain. And sometimes even there's not even a trigger. You could just wake up and experiencing that emotional pain. You could just be at work and nobody said anything, nobody's done anything, and it just arises from within. Now, what do you do with that? How do you cope with that emotional feeling? So ultimately, addiction is a coping strategy to help us deal with that experience, to help us deal with or cope with that emotional pain that we're feeling. Whether we use dopamine, go on social media, scroll, 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 doom scrolling. I forgot to put that one. Doom scrolling, right? It's an addiction. But what it's doing is it's to help numb the negative emotions, the uncomfortable emotions that we feel that's like kind of like bubbling away under the surface. And as soon as we relax, immediately those emotions come like, quick, get my phone, quick, scroll, 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 so that we don't feel those emotions. It's a coping strategy. And the idea of the addiction ultimately is so that it alters our state away from that pain. Because obviously, ultimately, that's what we're trying to do. It's an uncomfortable feeling, and it's like, right, I want to get away from it. So Alice Miller, she's a Swiss author and psychotherapist, she says this. What is addiction really? It is a sign, a signal, a symptom of distress. It is a language that tells us about a plight that must be understood. So when we go through an addiction, even if it's a phase of an addiction, maybe it's never happened before, happens for a little time, and then it might even go away. It's we need to recognize that. Why did it happen in the first place? What's underlying? What's underneath that? What's driving that? And it's not just I'm a bad person or something like that. There's a deeper reason. So addiction is a symptom of something deeper. And then we also need to approach addiction. We need to approach how we behave with the mood of compassion. Because often what happens is when we don't approach with the mood of compassion and we go through guilt and shame, we actually exacerbate the feelings and the emotional wound, shall we say, and make it even worse. And then it actually feeds the addiction. So we want to fight almost the addictive qualities or the addictive experience through compassion. So there are 4 steps to overcoming addictions. So I'm just going to go through them now. So the first one is to understand the overall pattern. So one of the first things we always want to bring, and one of the reasons why I do these sessions, is to help you develop awareness. Because when you can understand it, like when you can understand the cycle of addiction, then at least you've got some idea of how to break it, shall we say. So become aware of how you engage in that cycle of addiction. So let me just give you the overall pattern, then I'm going to go through some examples. So here you can see, let's say there's some trauma event or sometimes trauma events. So little t can be something like emotional neglect. It's not necessarily that a parent or a caregiver does something like physically quite dramatic, shall we say. It could be actually they're just on their phones all the time and they don't give any attention to the child or or to the person, or they're just busy in their own thoughts or their own world, whatever it is. But they don't necessarily do anything directly harmful. So that we call little t. Or it could be something like big T. So whatever that is, whatever that trauma event or events is, and it could be over a period of years. The point is, what does it create? First of all, creates an emotional wound. So that emotional wound is is the source, shall we say, of that pain or that uncomfortable state. And then after, because we want to avoid this painful emotional state, we develop a coping mechanism. And then what happens is there is a trigger which presses on that emotional wound, and then we go round this cycle again. So when that trigger presses on that emotional wound again, the uncomfortable emotions start to come up to the conscious level. We're like, freak out, how do I get away from this? Bang, go to coping mechanism. Coping mechanism, coping mechanism. Maybe we come back to normal state. Then there's another trigger, and bang, presses on that emotional wound, and we keep going back round and round this cycle until it becomes an addiction. Now it's like we do it without thinking about it. How many of you just instinctively go to your phone when there's uncomfortable emotions? You don't even think about it, like you don't drop what's the expression? You don't drop a beat. Like you just uncomfortable emotion, bang, phone. Uncomfortable emotion, bang, phone. So that has now become an addiction. Like getting that dopamine hit, scroll, 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 getting that dopamine hit. Yes, it helps us to avoid or numb those uncomfortable emotions, but it doesn't actually resolve the situation. And so we become addicted. So let's take a specific example. Let's take work addiction. So somebody could have been constantly criticized, whether as a child or even as an adult. The point is there's constant criticism going on. So what's the emotional wound that's created? It's the feeling that I'm not enough. Constantly, anything they do, constantly feeling judged. Um, so gradually it's like, oh, I'm not enough, I'm not enough. So now what does this lead to? So there's that pain of the self-judgment. So now it's not even that person necessarily who's criticizing. Now that voice has gone in the head, and now we're doing it to ourselves. And because we're constantly judging ourselves, then let's say at work, for example, we have a work addiction because we're constantly checking and rechecking, checking and rechecking, and making sure everything is as perfect as it can be because we have this feeling of not enough. In one sense, whatever we do is not enough. Now, a trigger could be we get told off by the boss. Even though we're trying so hard, I don't know, maybe the boss is having a bad day and for no reason he just lashes out or she lashes out. And then we get told off by the boss. But what does that telling off by the boss do? It presses on the nerve of that emotional wound. I'm not enough. We're already feeling we're not enough. Then we get told off. Now it's even more pressing on that wound that we're not feeling enough. And of course, then we get that pain, that self-judgment comes up even more, and we just absorb ourselves in work even more. And it becomes an addiction. We can't leave work. I have one client, and actually I have a few clients. Sometimes they can't leave work. They're at work till late just because they're trying to be perfect, just because they're trying to make sure everything is done properly, because the feeling of being not enough is driving them. They don't need to. So understanding this pattern is the first step. Yeah, so let's look at comfort food addiction, where maybe it starts off with there's no physical affection, especially as a young child, but even through adolescence. No physical affection, no saying I love you, no being held. So that could create the emotional wound that I'm not worthy of love. And what does that do? That then creates that feeling of being unloved, the lack of love within. And so as a coping mechanism, we turn to comfort food. Tastes nice. Why? Maybe food is a kind of love language. So through the sensation of eating food, it almost translates to the feeling of being loved. Like that. It's like when the belly is full, it gives a sense of satisfaction. It's almost like mimics the feeling of being loved. Now, there could be a trigger. So that person has an argument with their partner, for example. What does that do? Again, it presses on the wound of I'm not worthy of love, and it re-triggers this entire cycle. So now, gradually, it starts to become an addiction. Don't feel loved, go to food. Don't feel loved, go to food. Don't feel loved, go to food. That just becomes like a default thing. There's no even thought process to it. It's like the emotion comes up and just the body almost moves automatically, robotically, like you can't even stop yourself. And I have one client who has sometimes eats so much that he feels sick, but he still can't stop himself. This is one that I heard. So in my training as a hypnotherapist, my mentor, she dealt with a client who was abused as a child. And because she was pretty. Now, how does that relate to eating fatty food? Let's see. So this client came to my hypnotherapist mentor because she couldn't ever lose weight and she was really struggling. So they used one style of hypnotherapy, which is to, shall we say, put like statements or affirmations into the subconscious mind. But that didn't work. So she came back to her. And so then she realized, my mentor realized, okay, we need to go a bit deeper. There must be some other emotional wound that's triggering this, that's causing this. So when she analyzed, then this came out that she was abused as a child. And so that created the emotional wound that if I'm pretty, then I'll be abused. Because that's what her abuser said. Her abuser said, I'm abusing you because you're pretty. And so that emotional wound was created. So now the fear or the shall we say the negative emotional state is then there's the fear of being abused again. So in order to protect her from being abused again, her subconscious mind went, right, eat fatty foods. Make yourself plump. Make yourself big. In other words, in her mind, not pretty. And therefore, you won't be abused. Like, doesn't necessarily make logical sense, especially as an adult. But this was formed as a child, remember, not as an adult. So when she was still, shall we say, potentially could be abused again. Now as an adult, obviously she can defend herself, she can speak out, etc. But that programming was there from when she was a child. So she got addicted to eating fat foods and became quite large. So now whenever she would lose weight, it would then re-trigger the emotional wound of pretty means being abused. So immediately she would go back into this cycle of eating fatty foods. And then she would go on a diet and then maybe lose some weight. And as soon as she would start to lose weight, immediately, bang, she would go back into this addictive cycle. So understanding the cycle, understanding the pattern, what it is you do is very important at the beginning, because then you can actually get to the root. So step number one was to kind of look at the pattern overall. Now you've seen the pattern. Step number two is identify the triggers. So what are they for you? And what trigger in particular sends you into a spiral, sends you down this rabbit hole, shall we say, or this looping. And when you understand those triggers, that will really help to make the change, to break the cycle. So for example, one client I'm dealing with, she was in a beautiful relationship, but she was like so in love. She felt she matched so well with her boyfriend. One of the reasons why they matched so well is because they brought the best out of each other. Like he brought the best out of her, and she was really attached to that. She felt like this guy is really good. And then the relationship broke. And there was so much grief and sadness related to this breakup. Essentially, she felt she had lost her soulmate, her life partner, like the person that matched so well. This is the person she's supposed to be with. When she spoke to her friends, sometimes her friends would say to her that, wow, we've been in relationships, we've never um, matched as well as you two have. So obviously that created even more grief. Like, oh no, why did this break? Oh God, why did this break? So the relationship breaking, what was the emotional wound that was formed is, will I ever find someone like him? And there's that constant feeling of lack, that feeling of grief, feeling of loss, like, oh no, why God, why? And one of the coping mechanisms for that feeling of loss is then to relive the memories of him. Because by reliving the memories of him and the wonderful experiences that they had together, it kind of soothes and pacifies to some degree that feeling of loss. But then there's a trigger. So she's on dating apps, she's going out even on dates. And then what happens when she doesn't match with potential partners? When it's like, I don't know, it's not attracted to him physically, or some other quality doesn't match, some comparison, shall we say, with her ex, it re-triggers the emotional wound. And then she goes around this cycle again. And what's happening is her feeling of loss and grief, that part of her is now growing. So whatever state we kind of spend a lot of time in, that state tends to grow. So if it's an angry state and we're always angry, that part of us tends to become stronger. So now if she's in this grief and sadness state, this feeling of lack, is she going to attract a partner? Not in this state. Because what is she radiating? She's radiating this feeling of lack. And whoever she meets, if we're always going to compare with that perfect ex, never going to find it. So this loop now, this becomes almost like an addiction. So identifying the trigger there is important. And then the next step is then to reduce the impact of the trigger. Right? If we understand, okay, this is the thing that sends me into the spiral. How can I reduce that? What practical steps can you take? So for example, if you take the client that I just spoke about, so what's the key trigger is that she's not matching with potentials. So not matching with potentials means we need to retrain or rewire the thought patterns that are creating that. So what happens is when she's meeting somebody, she's always comparing with her ex, whether consciously or subconsciously. So the idea would be to actually decide what are the qualities that I want in a person in the first place, independent of the ex. It's almost like pretend that you never had the relationship with him. And therefore, just what are the qualities that I want? What I go through this relationship coaching is to then define which of those qualities are, shall we say, non-negotiables, which of those qualities are absolute must, and which of them can we say, okay, we can get away with this. So for example, if the person isn't so physically attractive, she might be like, okay, I'm willing to let go of that one because anyway, when we get older, that's not going to be such a big deal. It's more the personality that's going to keep us together. Some compromise like that might have to be there. But the point is, it's not being as a comparison to the ex. Because is she going to find somebody who is exactly like him? It's very unlikely. So we have to move on. She has to move on. So the trigger here, not matching with potentials, now we change the thought pattern regards it. We hijack where the thought goes, oh my God, he's not my ex. We hijack that thought pattern and take it to a different way. And ultimately, what we want to do is actually to heal the trauma wound. So that'll be step 4. And again, how can you do this? What practical steps can you take to do this? To actually heal the wound. That's the root. So the initial step number 3, is to reduce the impact of the trigger. That's in one sense like a temporary solution. That's to help keep you going while you're in the process of step 4, which is to actually heal the trauma wound. Because the trauma wound is the root cause of this whole cycle. It's not the trigger. Trigger could change to something else. And then what are you going to do? You know, okay, I reduce the impact of that trigger, but then there's another trigger could be that again presses on the emotional wound. Ultimately, we've got to heal the emotional wound. So for your emotional wound, for your trauma wound, what practical steps can you take? Let's revisit the comfort food addiction. So somebody didn't have physical affection as a kid. And so that created the whole cycle of I'm not worthy of love. So one of the processes that we use is called the inner child healing. So it's like we go back to the past. We go back to that child who didn't receive those cuddles, didn't hear those magic words, I love you, that didn't have that warmth of their parents, their arms and their hearing the heartbeat. So inner child healing allows us to revisit that child and give them that feeling of being safe, feeling of being protected, feeling of being loved, feeling of belonging, and even ultimately, you can see in this case, give them the feeling that they are worthy of love. And I'll say that to you. You are worthy of love. And I'm not just saying it to you in your current age, shall we say, in your current state. I'm saying that to you even as a child. If you go to the child version of you, if you imagine going to the 5-year-old, 7-year-old, 10-year-old version of you that didn't feel comforted, that didn't feel loved, that didn't get that physical affection, and you say the words, you are worthy of love. And you really say it with compassion, you really say it from your heart to that child and let that child receive it. That's part of inner child healing. So, as part of step 4, identify what the wound is in the first place. And you may need to journal or meditate or speak to a therapist in order to identify what that might be, especially if it's in the childhood or maybe many years ago. Um, you need to examine the relationship with your parents. Sometimes it's with siblings. Sometimes it's things that's happened at school, even either with bullies at school or with teachers, or maybe it's even with relatives, uncles or aunties, something like that. Why is there? Where does that emotional wound come from, and what's inside of it? And then we work on healing that wound. And I especially call this wound the void. So in Eckhart Tolle's work, he calls it the pain body. And I haven't actually read his books. One client told me when she heard my explanation of the void, she said, "Oh, that sounds like the pain body." So whether you call it the pain body, there's other psychologists, they call it different parts. We have different parts within us. So whatever terminology you want to use, but the point is there's some emotional wound there that needs healing. A lot of us, we're addicted to our emotions. We're addicted in the sense of we're obsessed with our own thoughts on what we're going through. We're addicted to these negative thought patterns. And then we become addicted to the coping mechanisms that numbs the pain because we're just always constantly feeling this pain. And we're always constantly looking for the coping mechanism and then going back to the pain and then going back because we're just addicted almost. We're just obsessed with our thoughts and ourselves. So there's a really important point here that the more you absorb in these emotions, the more you actually suffer. So to begin the process of detaching from our emotions, detaching from our thoughts, detaching from our pain, become the observer of your emotions, the observer of your thoughts, and also the observer of your pain. I don't know if you've ever had the experience where you may be crying and it's almost like you're standing next to you, watching yourself cry. You're like the observer. So you're going through the emotions, you're going through the pain, but you're not attached to the pain. You, as the observer, are not attached to the pain. It's almost like your body is going through it, your mind is going through it, but it's not you because you are separate from your mind, you're separate from your body. We can't just avoid these emotions. We can't just numb them. We can't just run away. And that's what leads to addictions because obviously in the process of running away, and then running away and then running away. We get addicted to whatever that activity is that helps us numb it. So Louise Hay, she's a famous coach, she's passed away now, but she's a famous coach. She said, "You're in pain because you have forgotten how to love yourself." A lot of the pain that we go through, a lot of the childhood trauma that we go through is ultimately we've kind of disconnected from ourselves. So the idea of loving yourself, it's not the kind of selfish idea of loving yourself. In one sense, it means reconnecting with yourself, with your true self. So the trauma that we go through disconnects us from our true self. So when we find that love for ourselves, when we reconnect with ourselves through self-compassion, that's what helps. And we have to do that. We have to reconnect with ourselves by healing the root cause of the addiction. And so what I'll say is self-compassion is the catalyst for healing trauma. And on that note, I have a new online course that is out. It's called Heartbreak to Heartfelt, and it's available on my website, nijdey.com/stores. And it goes through how to reconnect with ourselves. And this course was originally called the Loving Yourself Workshop. It is about how to reconnect with yourself. It goes through how the void is created, and it goes through all of that in detail. There's lots of exercises to do. So this is, I would say, is my signature course. So if you haven't attended that course or you haven't heard about it, please check it out. So these are my concluding words. We need to move from self-obsession to self-compassion, from self-absorption to self-awareness, from self-gratification to self-care, and finally move from selfishness to self-love, and ultimately to selfless service, to being our best.
In this lesson, we explored what addiction truly is and how many of our habits are shaped by unresolved trauma. Addiction isn't a sign of weakness, it's the mind and body trying to cope when emotions become too heavy to hold. We looked at why people turn to comfort food, alcohol, shopping, and other behaviors to soothe emotional pain, and how these patterns could turn into cycles that feel difficult to break. You also learned key steps to healing, understanding the emotional root of your habits, identifying your triggers, and beginning the process of recovery. Let us know one takeaway from this lesson in the comments. And if it helped you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need it.